A mustard seed is minuscule. A small, unassuming object about 1 to 2 millimeters in diameter. But if planted and cultivated, if it just so happens to fall into a fertile enough patch of soil, this small, unassuming object turns into a grand, lush, fruit-bearing tree with complex parts like venated leaves and a bark with textured lines and patterns. That is what an idea is to me. A domino is essentially a piece in a children's game, usually small, plain, and unassuming. But if arranged just right, one domino could lead to the collapse of 1,000 others. That is what an idea is to me. Something so raw and unassuming, yet it holds so much power. The power to change lives and the power to save lives. To me, an idea is the very foundation of everything we know, feel, and believe. I believe this with full certainty because where I am now is the product of that small, unassuming mustard seed that was an idea. I would like to share the story of my late grandfather, Benedict Kasekende. He died when I was very young, and so I didn't truly get to meet him. And I wish I could stand here and tell you stories about his character, but I truly can't. But if there's one thing my aunts, my uncles, and even my dad made sure I knew for certain, it was that my grandfather loved and adored education. Now, when I was younger, I struggled to understand the gravity of his love and adoration for education, and oftentimes thought that his love for learning meant that he was boring or uptight. But it's as I grew up that my previous notion changed. See, I went from being 100% certain that my grandfather's love for education meant that he was mundane, to being confused as to how we got from point A to point B. As I heard more and more stories, I realized that point A was a young man who grew up in a very poor family. A young man who should have made his kids working on the farm or finding a means to make money his #1 priority. But instead, he had this laughable idea that education is key. That it didn't matter if his kids wore the same pair of shoes for 2 years straight, as long as that pair of shoes clothed their feet on their way to school. Point A was 18 kids growing up in rural Uganda who slowly turned their father's idea into something tangible. Now here we are at point B, where those same 18 kids who walked to school every day became the second generation after my grandfather to study abroad for university, and they made a name for themselves. Now, when I was younger, I would often wonder why and feel frustration over the fact that my dad would never get me the shoes I really loved or the tablet that I ogled at, yet he was so quick to pay for something as unimportant as school fees. But it's as I stand here today that I realize the extent of the effects of an idea. It is as I stand before you that I think about the fact that my grandfather's idea that education is key was the first domino that will knock down thousands. I am proud to be part of the ripple effect and know that I had the privilege to be struck by the domino before me that allowed me to have an education. That growing up, I was encouraged to learn and to grow. I remember, as a kid, I had my heart set on being a pediatrician because I loved science. And then I wanted to be a lawyer because I loved history and English. And now, my love for chemistry has sparked my interest in biochemical sciences. But to think, if my domino was picked up and placed just a couple centuries ago, it would have been discarded without a second thought. If my domino was placed in a country like Afghanistan, I could be killed simply for wanting to learn. If my domino was placed in rural Uganda, education might have been completely out of the picture for me, and I could have been looked at as simply a means to carry on a lineage. So why does my domino need to be placed in exactly the right position for me to be seen as worthy enough to cultivate my brain? The limitation of women's education and the prioritization of men's education is something that goes back to ancient Greece, where women were largely excluded from schools due to the societal beliefs linking education and responsibility, which was only capable for men. Women, on the other hand, were confined to the private sphere where they were tasked with managing the household. See, the very foundation of education inequality is something that I often think about and can't help but point out how contradictory it is. See, the ancient Greeks believed that women were supposed to stay home and take after the household and look after the household because that is what they were supposed to do. Yet, in the same breath, they argued that to receive an education, you had to have responsibility. But how could a woman manage a household and the very life of a human without utmost responsibility? These same ideologies were shared worldwide up until the Enlightenment during the 17th and 18th century, where some of these norms were challenged, with thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft advocating for women's rights to education. Her ideas directly opposed the prevailing beliefs that women were naturally inferior to men and that their primary role were as wives and mothers. Because of this, she and thinkers like her received ridicule and immediate dismissal. The 19th century saw progress with Emma Willard revolutionizing female education in the United States by founding the Troy Female Seminary, the first higher education institution for women. These women were mocked and ostracized simply for saying, "We want to impact the world." For the longest time, I struggled to understand how people, let alone governments, could prohibit women's education. I thought that thinking logically, it didn't matter what gender you are. More people equals more productivity, a boost in the economy, and a growth of innovation. But it was devastating to realize that gender norms were so deeply ingrained in culture and beliefs that it was laughable to think a woman could contribute to the growth of a nation. Imagine I stood up here and advocated for education for potted plants. If I stood here with a slideshow detailing why potted plants deserve the right to learn and impact the world, I'm sure you'd all find that laughable and wouldn't even consider it a reasonable thought, which it's understandable for a number of reasons, but this is the way women were looked at. You see, a woman going to school then seemingly had as much reasoning as a potted plant at getting an education now. To think without the innovations of incredible women like Marie von Britten-Brown, Ada Lovelace, Tabitha Babbitt, Jennifer Doudna, Josephine Cochrane, we would not have innovations like home security systems, computer programming algorithms, the dishwasher, the circular saw, and the foundations that have led to advanced medical breakthroughs. The history of women struggling to find their place in education is something that is fundamental and needs to be talked about. However, I wish it was actually the history because women like me and some of you are still fighting for their right to education. According to UN Women, only 22% of African women complete secondary school and even fewer go off to university. This is largely brought about by cultural norms and economic barriers, enforcing the expectations that these young girls must stay home and take on household duties instead of going to school. Another study by UNICEF indicates that 1 in 3 girls in sub-Saharan Africa is married before the age of 18, forcing them to drop out of school. While researching for this talk, my most heartbreaking find was the safety concerns surrounding women going to school. Women face serious risks on their way to and from school, including physical and sexual violence, particularly in conflict zones and rural areas. Furthermore, in certain areas, sexual harassment and exploitation is an unfortunate reality for these girls, often forcing them to drop out of school and face stigma. So even if her domino lands in a family that can and will support her education, even if her domino lands in a country that doesn't prohibit women from accessing education, she still runs the risk of being harassed on her way to, at, or on her way from an educational facility. I would like to talk about the female athletes at Michigan State University. These exceptional ladies not only beat the odds by accessing higher education, but were also accomplished gymnasts. They trained vigorously, daily, putting so much trust in their coaches. Larry Nassar, was a sports physician who took advantage of their vulnerability by sexually harassing them over several decades. He abused hundreds of girls under the guise of medical treatment, with some of them being minors as young as 6 years old. Complaints were made to coaches and university officials, but these women were silenced and ignored. Among the over 500 survivors, many dropped out of university and even quit gymnastics due to the lasting effects and trauma. Educational facilities are supposed to be a safe space for everyone. And yet for some girls, even being lucky enough to access this safe space is like being placed on a battlefield with no weapons. So this is why I ask, why do our dominoes need to be placed in exactly the right position, just at the right angle, for us to be part of the chain reaction? In a chain reaction, there are factors that increase its reactivity, like catalysts, a temperature increase, and a higher reactant concentration. These factors are what make the reaction more impactful. These factors are where my hope lies. There are people and organizations working diligently to ensure that women are part of this chain reaction, that it is more explosive. Organizations like the Malala Fund have made great strides to remove the barriers that prevent girls from accessing 12 years of quality, free education. The Campaign for Female Education has supported the attendance of over 4.8 million girls in primary and secondary school across sub-Saharan Africa. Michelle Obama launched the Let Girls Learn initiative, which mobilized over $1 billion to help adolescent girls attain quality education and support girls' education programs worldwide. Education is not just a right, it is a revolution. The spark that ignites progress, the domino that sets everything into motion, and the mustard seed that grows into a mighty tree, bearing the fruits of empowerment, equality, and innovation. Yet, for countless women, this revolution is stifled, held hostage by cultural norms, systemic barriers, and societal indifference. But I stand here today as a testament to what happens when one domino is allowed to fall, when an idea is cultivated and brought to life. My story, my grandfather's legacy, and the story of millions of girls who dare to dream of an education are proof of the transformative power of hope, determination, and collective action. We cannot afford to wait for the perfect conditions, the perfect angle, or the perfect placement of our dominoes. We must become the catalyst, raising awareness and challenging norms. We must demand a world where every girl, no matter her circumstance, can view education not as a privilege, but as a birthright. Thank you.